Welcome to the beginning of the end of our Modern Architecture course. Thank you for being with us during the past 7 weeks. I hope you enjoyed what you saw and what you learned in this course. It's my pleasure to share some of what I know about modern architecture. In this video, I would like to summarize and draw some conclusions from our course and eventually give you some guidelines on how to continue on your own and how to explore more these topics and enjoy more of modern architecture. We started in the beginning with the Futurism, this movement from Italy where basically they broke up with the past and started from scratch, completely new ideas inspired by Industrial Revolution, by the war, by the dynamism, and by all those dynamic changes that were happening in the modern world at that time. Marinetti, the most important representative of the movement and founder, they eventually produced 50 different manifestos, anywhere from poetry, music, sculpture, painting, and even architecture. They designed a new kind of space, and this is an idea, a sculpture by Boccioni, space revolving around Bordeaux, which was so inspirational for kinetic architecture which was no longer symmetrical but was dynamic, was moving, and was basically a much more dynamic and rich space that people would inhabit. Antonio Sant'Elia is this brilliant architect who died very young, and he built almost nothing, but he left us some incredible drawings like this one for Station, or this other one for the Città Nuova, or the New City from 1914, which were so inspirational with 4 generations to come. After we moved to Russian Constructivism, and we saw this invention of abstraction, which is quite unique and happened precisely in Russia at that time, and then later spread all over. Here we have Malevich, who was the inventor of abstraction, in painter whose style was called suprematism, basically a combination between pure geometries that would combine and create dynamic space, not representational of the world, but completely abstract and independent. The most important project by one of the sculptors and architects from the movement is Tatlin's monument for the Third International Spiral, with 4 volumes inside that were turning during the year. We saw the work of Melnikov from 1925, this brilliant pavilion for the International Exposition. We also looked at the work of Ginsburg, follower of Le Corbusier, who designed a residential building that would later influence the Unité d'Habitation itself. Then we saw other work by Melnikov, like for example the Workers' Club, where we have these large volumes that were cantilevering above the entrance of the building, creating very dynamic and very charged space, and a contrast between transparencies and then opaque volumes. We also looked at the work of Leonidov, a young architect who did not build much, but who was one of the brilliant architects of that movement, and who would be so influential for generations to come, for example, for the work of Rem Koolhaas from OOAc-MA. We then jumped into Frank Lloyd Wright, the most important American architect, and who was probably one of the fathers of modern architecture. And we had a guest lecture by Professor John Lobel, who told us about the work of Wright from the early projects like this one to some masterpieces like this, which is the Falling Water House from 1935, where Frank Lloyd Wright created the perfect integration with nature, a building that rises from the ground and which merges with nature, connecting the interior and the exterior and projected above the water. Some of the later work and more mature work of Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, is this abstract geometry with transparency of the Johnson-Wexner building project, and the Guggenheim, this brilliant project that we have here in New York with 2 main volumes, entrance in between a spiral, an exhibition space where it's designed as a spiral in which people are kind of looking at painting sidewise, but created very unique space and probably one of the most important spaces of the 20th century. We then looked at the work of the Dutch neoplasticism that was quite inspired by Lloyd Wright. And here we have some furniture by Rietveld, some painting by Theo van Doensburg, and Mondrian, who was basically the painter who was behind their ideology. Work of Theo van Doensburg, where we saw the independent planes that are intersecting to create a space, and here the work of Rietveld in the Schroeder House, and at the end the last project, the Café au Bed by Theo van Doensburg. We went to Bauhaus, this school of design so important from the early 20th century, founded by Gropius in 1919, which was a combination between painting, sculpture, architecture, pottery, furniture design, and theater. We see this brilliant faculty which merged, which kind of met at the same time and invented this modern style and created this workshop for modernity. Bauhaus moved to Dessau in 1925 with this building by Walter Gropius, and they designed furniture and also theater, like we see here, costumes and music. We then moved to Mies van der Rohe, who another great German architect, who went from designing traditional houses to modern buildings like this, a project for a skyscraper, then built eventually his first modern projects, and then his masterpiece, the Barcelona Pavilion from 1929, where he has a combination of transparencies, glass materials, reflections, water, and this very dynamic and fluid space. He applied the concepts into housing design for this house in Brno in the Czech Republic, the Tugendhat house, where he used some of the same complex ideas on a residential scale. Le Corbusier, who is the most important architect of the 20th century, probably the most important architect in history because of his writings, ideas, architecture, combination with sculpture and painting, who influenced anyone from the design of buildings to the design of cities in the years to come. We follow his career through the early projects, like for example this one, the house for his parents, Maison Blanche, the invention of purism with Aux Enfants, this new representational way, and his most important book that has been reprinted probably over 20 times, 13 times while he was alive and probably 100 times after he passed away. This is the book. We saw a Esprit Nouveau pavilion, which is basically a cell of this immeuble villa, or a residential building that is designed as a villa, which is part of his plan for 3 million inhabitants, which was partly built into, designed, adapted for Paris as the plan was on. We oversaw the creation of the CIAM, the Comité International d'Architecture Moderne, which was a movement of some of the most important architects of the 20th century that joined together in defense of modern architecture and fighting together for this revolution of architecture in the 20th century. Le Corbusier's masterpiece from 1928 was the Ville Savoie, where he combined the classical spirit with the design, the aesthetics of the machine age, which we see here. Vira Dios was his project for a city and designed with his new principles, and it was also a book with kind of almost like a manual for designing cities and creating this new world. The Pavillon du Temple Nouveau was his last building, designed before the Second World War with his cousin Pierre Genera, where they exhibited projects of cities, architecture. They wrote manifestos, theories, which were all designed to transform the reality and to transform the cities and buildings that people lived in. We moved on to Alvar Aalto from his early buildings to his mature period of his sanatorium here, who basically humanized modern architecture, adapting it to the human scale, light, sound, and nature. He was very much inspired by nature, as you can see in this industrial design for vases made out of glass. And he combined the modern architecture and style with Nordic tradition, as we can see here in this Finnish pavilion from Paris 1937, where he basically cladded everything with wood and created really innovative interiors. His Villa Mairea is the masterpiece for his residential work integrating with nature. And we ended up with this dorm for the MIT students in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in which on one side he adapted to the urban facade of the city, and on the other side to the curves and the fluid geometry of the Charles River. We ended with the work of Italian rationalists, the work of Terrani and his first modern building here, the connection between rationalist architecture and the fascist party and movement in Italy from the 20s and 30s. We saw the opposition of the rationalists with this Stile Litorale by Piacentini, who designed the University of Rome with a number of other architects, which was a combination of traditional architecture, stripped traditionalism into modernism. We saw Casa del Fascio in Como, the most important built project by Terrani, basically a prism behind the cathedral, which was transparent, would let people in and out, and was made out of glass, lots of glass and transparencies, but at the same time respected the historical orders and the rhythm of historical buildings. We saw Danteon, one of the last projects by Terrani, which was not built, but it was basically built form of the Dante's Divine Comedy, where people would go from Inferno to Purgatorio and then end up with Paradise, into this new transformed world where they would walk around transparencies, reflections, and under the blue sky of Rome. So this is one of the ideas of modern architecture. The point is to transform people. The point is to make people live differently and perceive their reality differently. It was the construction of utopia. By default, modern architecture was an invention of the new world and its materialization into a built form, which makes it very powerful and which makes this architectural revolution of the early 20th century so transformative and so important for human evolution and for the state of the world which we live in today. I invite you to look further into modern architecture. This is just the beginning and this is just the base for you, but there is so much more to explore out there. So I invite you to read, to look, to walk, and to experience the architecture and the beauty of the world in which we live in.